I hope you're not expecting me to follow that up very well. You are. There is something about services like this. There's something about when we give ourselves permission to see things through the eyes of a child. In this series of Advent, we have been exploring the theme of what does it mean for a weary and a tired world to rejoice. A couple weeks ago, we talked about that we have to acknowledge our weariness. We have to acknowledge the fact that at times we are tired. And we just feel like there's nothing left in the tank. Last week was an incredibly powerful testimony and message. And if you weren't here last week, I really encourage you to find the YouTube video on our YouTube channel and hear what Philip and Robin had to say to us about the power of a second life. The power of saying yes to God and the joy that they find in connection with people. In his book, Dangerous Wonder, author Mike Yaconelli talks about how, as a kid, he was so fascinated with Superman. Everything in his life revolved around Superman. Now, you have to remember when Mike was of that age back, he was 9, 10 years old. That was back in the 50s, because Mike has since passed away. But he talked about everything was about Superman. He had the capes, he had the costumes, he had decorations on his wall in his bedroom. He was fascinated with flying. Now, of course, he said his ability to fly was dependent upon what he could jump off of and survive without breaking her bones. He said his mom used to get so frustrated with him because she would find good bath towels all over the yard that he had used as a cape. Somebody want that back? You're welcome. Here, I thought it was a gift. And he said, it got to the point that the other neighborhood kids didn't want to play with him anymore because he always insisted on being Superman, because he knew more about flying. He knew more about how capes worked. He knew more about what Superman could do. There, Mike said, in that was the wonder and the amazement of being Superman as a kid and losing himself into that world. One day, he says he woke up and he was never Superman again. Capes all went away, but something happened. I'm sure that most of us can relate to this story. There is something in the way that children see the world that they allow themselves to wonder. They allow themselves to be amazed by things. I was watching our children's eyes this morning as they're looking around at everything happening and just lost in the grandeur of it all. But somewhere along the line, we lose that. Somewhere along the line, as we grow up, and my brother always likes to tell his kids, don't grow up because it's a trap. There's something that happens. We lose it. When's the last time any of you sat on the floor and played with a doll? Okay, for some of you that means getting up is a challenge, I know. But sometimes as we get older, we forget what it means to lose ourselves in amazement and wonder. So just to reveal a little bit, this is my 53rd Christmas. And when you think about it, when I was a kid, there was something that was so exciting about Christmas coming. There were routines of putting up the tree as a family, and we all look forward to that, and we look forward to the hot chocolate and to the candy canes afterwards. There was an excitement in our grandparents coming and the family being together. For the nights leading up to Christmas, you couldn't sleep. But I don't have that anymore. In fact, when December rolls around, I have to admit that sometimes there is a part of me that goes, oh, it's another Christmas. That means I have to do this and this and this and this. And our house is going to get invaded on that day, and our house will get invaded on this day, and we have to go invade somebody else's house on this day. And the excitement of Christmas just kind of goes away. And the message of Christmas certainly gets lost in that. And any type of amazement or wonder is just kind of gone. But I know that that's not just me. I want to turn to our scripture reading this morning from Luke 1, 57 to 66. If you could follow along with me, it's in your program. Now the time had come for Elizabeth to give birth, and she had a son. Then her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her his great mercy, and they rejoiced with her. When they came to circumcise the child on the 8th day, they were going to name him Zechariah, after his father. But his mother responded and said, no, he will be called John. Then they said to her, well, none of your relatives has that name. What? Why would you do that? So they motioned to his father to find out what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet, because remember, when he questioned the angel at the time of the good news, the angel said, your lips are sealed. You can't talk for the next 9 months. His name is John. And they were all amazed. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue was set free, and he began to speak. And he praised God. Zechariah hasn't been able to talk for 9 months, and he praises God. And fear came on all those who lived around them, and all these things were being talked about throughout the hill country of Judea. All who heard about him took it to heart, saying, what then will this child become? For indeed, the Lord's hand was with him. Sometimes when we read these stories, we need to put ourselves into the picture. We need to envision what it would have been like for us to be there. Can you imagine what it was like for Elizabeth? That her husband comes home after serving in the temple as a priest and he can't talk. Maybe some wives would rejoice in that. But anyways, what would that be like? Your husband goes to work, he comes home, and he can't speak. I would think there'd be some questions. I would think there would be some wondering and some pondering about what is going on, especially when he writes out that he saw an angel. And then he would have to admit, maybe, that he can't talk because he gave the angel a hard time, and so the angel zipped his lips shut. But either way, he couldn't talk. For the whole time that his wife is pregnant, and the time that Mary comes to visit them, and all this stuff is going on, Zechariah is watching from the outside. Maybe he can communicate by writing on a tablet, but back in those days, they didn't have what we have for technology, so writing on a tablet was difficult and time-consuming. So you certainly didn't carry on a process or an in-depth conversation. So through the whole pregnancy, Elizabeth and Zechariah really have no way to really communicate. Well, she did. And he would have to listen. But he couldn't say anything back. Can you imagine what it would be like for Zechariah for 9 months during this everything going on to not be able to talk? He can't share with his wife the feelings, the thoughts, the conflict, the emotions, everything that is inside of him. He's along for the ride. And then the big day comes, and they're blessed with a baby boy. Don't forget, at this stage of their life, they are quite elderly. And they're blessed with this baby boy, and now it comes time to name him. And of course, in the tradition of the day, you named your firstborn son after the father. And that's what they wanted to do. And Mary, or Elizabeth and Zechariah said, no. His name will be John, as the Lord decreed. And all of a sudden, Zechariah can speak again. It says his tongue was set free, and the first thing he does is he praises God. He must have been completely overwhelmed. I can't imagine what that experience would have been like. That as soon as you inscribe on that tablet, his name is John, as the angel requested of you, that all of a sudden that action sets your voice free again. You see, when we really get into the Christmas story, when we get into the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah, when we get into the story of Mary and Joseph, think about it this way. How would we have responded to Mary and Joseph? Mary is an unwed teenage mother who is bearing the child that her fiancé did not father. And I know it's easy for us to say now, yeah, but it was God. God stepped into the picture, and that's why Mary's pregnant, and so that makes it all okay. But what would it have been like in that day? Think about how judgmental we can be about single, unwed mothers today. And we likely would have reacted the same way. Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem for the census because that's where Joseph's family was from. So that means that all of Joseph's family would have been in Bethlehem with them, yet none of them took him in. They ended up in a stable because nobody wanted them. When we think through how God orchestrated his plan for salvation in the baby Jesus, you can't help but be amazed. There is so much wonder that comes from thinking this through. But the problem is sometimes as we get older, and as we've done this many times, and as we've lived life, we become hardened. We become jaded. We become cynical. And all of those things gather in us to temper how we see life. But this morning, as the Christmas story is told through the eyes of our children, and you see the wonder and the amazement in their eyes, you start to realize just what you're missing when you don't allow yourself to be amazed by the story again. I had the opportunity this week to see the movie The Greatest Christmas Pageant Ever. Anybody here seen it? A couple people. If you haven't, by the way, I would recommend it. But I am going to give away a spoiler. So in the movie, there is a family of kids who really are on the down and out. We never meet their parents. The parents are a mystery. But to these kids, because they live in squalor, there really has never been much of a Christmas. And any Christmas they have ever had revolved around Santa Claus and some recycled gifts. But they had never heard the story of Christmas through Scripture. And so these kids kind of perform, they're not very well behaved, and they did a hostile takeover of a church Christmas play, is all you could say. But it's interesting as they are asking questions and looking at this through the eyes of kids who have never heard this story before, and they have a lot of questions. Like, why did Herod want to kill Jesus? Why did nobody deal with Herod on that? Why was Herod allowed to kill all the babies under the age of 2? Why did the wise men bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh? A baby doesn't want gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They want toys. And the questions go on and on and on about all these things in the story of Christmas that we take for granted because we've heard the story so many times. And it opened my eyes again. It opened my eyes again to see the message of Christmas in a new light and to allow myself to be amazed. It's hard work sometimes to peel away the layers that accumulate in our lives over time. Sometimes we just don't want to, because under those layers can be painful things that we don't want to deal with. But when we don't do that work, we lose the amazing message. We lose the wonder and the divine in the message of Christmas. Also in that book, Dangerous Wonder, and I just want to leave you with this to ponder. Mike tells the story of a Christmas that he never forgot. So he later on in his life, and he said that year had been very, very difficult because he had a very close friend that was in and out of the hospital all year battling cancer. And when December rolled around, it was unspoken that this would be this friend's last Christmas. And everybody just prayed that there was something that could make this Christmas special for him. And he said a few days before Christmas, he kind of rallied a little bit strength-wise, and they talked to the doctors, and the doctors said, you know, there is no harm in you going home to be with your family for Christmas. Don't spend it in the hospital. They knew it would be his last. So they got home, and Mike arranged to go over on Christmas Day to see his friend and his wife and just spend time with them. And Mike said, let's celebrate communion. Let's celebrate communion while you're home. That morning he got a phone call, and it was his friend's wife, and she said, can you wait an hour? Because our grandson and his girlfriend are coming, and they're bringing her 2 kids from a previous relationship. And we really want them to witness this. Mike said, yeah, that's fine. I'll come an hour later. So he did. And he met them, and they gathered around the kitchen table. And at first it was just the adults, and one of the kids popped his head in and said, can we come sit at the table with you and watch this? And Mike asked the parents, said, is that okay? Yeah, come on. So they all gathered as a group, and so then the 11-year-old Joshua says, well, can I take communion with you? And Mike looked at his mom, and his mom looked at her boyfriend, which was the grandson, and the grandson said, well, we've talked about this, and I'm okay with it if his mom is okay with it. And the grandparents thought this was pretty awesome. So Mike said he handed out, they had the bread and they passed it around, everybody broke some off, and they poured some of the juice into everybody's cup, so they all had it. And all of a sudden, Joshua blurts out in the middle of this as Mike is talking and says, how do you know if God is speaking to you? And Mike said, it completely blew my train of thought that this 11-year-old come out with that. And Mike said, I really didn't know what to say. So I said to him, well, sometimes when you're quiet, and if you try really hard, you could hear God speaking. Mike says, I just gave an adult answer to an 11-year-old about how God speaks to you. But he said, I didn't know what else to say. And after he gave that answer, he said, you could see Joshua get really quiet. And he kind of scrunched up his eyes and kind of withdrew into himself. And everybody was just quiet because they didn't know what was going on. And all of a sudden, Joshua's eyes pop open. He goes, I heard it. I heard God speak. You can imagine what the reaction from the adults was. Mike said, I kind of patronized him and said, really? You heard God speak? What did he say? What did God say to you, Joshua? Joshua looked at him, looked at his grandparents, and he said, God told me not to forget about him. Do not forget me. And Mike said in that moment, he was just incredibly humbled. He said, we gave this kid an adult answer to his question, but he said, in that answering, he said, I never imagined that God might actually show up and speak to this 11-year-old. The thought never crossed my mind. And he said it was with absolute amazement and humility that I realized that God did speak to this 11-year-old. God showed up with the faith of a child who was trying to listen. This Christmas, this Advent season, as we are walking towards Christmas, I ask you this: are you expecting God to show up? Or is your heart so hard, your life so cynical, your outlook so jaded that there is no longer any room for God to show up in your life? Can you still be amazed? Can you still wonder? Can you still lose yourself as Mavry loses herself when we sing and she dances in the aisle? It's awesome. And I'm going to say, probably many of us think it's awesome, but nobody joins her. Just say it. My prayer is for you this Christmas that you make room in your heart for the wonder, for the amazement, for the divine intervention that happened in the birth of Jesus Christ. I pray that you see it through fresh eyes, and I pray that you make room in your heart for God to show up, for God to meet you this Christmas and let him wrap his arms around you and say, you know what? This is how much I love you. I sent my son. I made a promise to Adam and Eve, and I never forgot, and I sent my son. And he sent his son in a very messy way, but he sent his son. There is just an incredible amount of amazement and wonder that we need to see it afresh. And I pray this Christmas that you allow yourself to be amazed at the message of Christmas. Amen.